They had a lot of starch, but in the corner of the plate, I'm glad you've asked me this question. There's a very interesting story I'm about to share with you, which I've never publicized. He gets served a burger and fries during that conversation. And he looks at me and says, "Doctor, how do you expect me to change my lifestyle if you're serving me the same crap?" There is good research to suggest that if you have good community relationships, good family relationships, good friendships, good meaningful, good quality relationships, that can actually protect you from the external stresses of life. McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Cadbury's, come on, this is a joke. Why have you even got those brands and those types of foods on the Eat Well plate? And the response was, Asim, you've got to understand, one of the biggest contributors to our economy is the food industry. I mean, it's very well documented that when the food industry know that a product is harmful, they will actually market it as being healthy. We have a pandemic of the vaccine injured. It is a massive public health crisis, and in my view, is the main likely driver of the excess deaths going on around the world. Highly likely, I have my own personal opinion, but let me say it as a scientist, highly likely that millions of people around the world have either been seriously harmed or killed by this vaccine. I can tell you right now, she comes from a place of purity and good intent, and she will be proven to be on the right side of history. But the Princess Maxima needs to get involved. This is very bad for the reputation of that institution which her name is attached to. My personal view, and I think it's quite clear for me and everything I knew about him, and I think that the vaccine is what killed him.
Als cardioloog redde hij het leven van tientallen mensen, maar een moment met een van zijn patiënten opende hem de ogen. Er is iets heel erg mis met onze lifestyle, door de belangen binnen de gezondheidszorg. Tegenwoordig probeert hij dus niet alleen vanuit zijn rol als cardioloog, maar ook als activist mensenlevens te redden, door zijn pijlen te richten op Big Food en Big Pharma. Dr. Asim Malhotra is on a mission.
My name is Dr. Asim Malhotra. I'm a consultant cardiologist, and my mission is to save lives a million at a time.
Hij begon zijn carrière als cardioloog, maar een ervaring met een van zijn patiënten zette hem op het pad van activisme.
And he says to me, "Doc, how do you expect me to change my lifestyle if you're serving me the same crap that brought me here in the first place?"
Om Engeland van haar obesitas af te helpen werkte hij samen met topchef Jamie Oliver en schreef hij diverse boeken, waaronder de Pyopy Diet. Via tv-optredens op onder andere de Britse BBC schopt hij zo nu en dan tegen de heilige huisjes van de belangen achter Big Food en verwerft daarmee dus ook de nodige controverse. Helemaal nu hij sinds de coronacrisis naast Big Food zijn pijlen heeft gericht op de mogelijk door Big Pharma aangerichte vaccinatieschade.
I think now it's high time that policymakers around the world put an end to the mandates.
So what you're saying in terms of the mRNA link to cardiovascular risk is that is it's been proven medically, has it? Scientifically?
Yeah.
Waren we getuigen van een zorgcrisis of coronacrisis?
I want to say that basically Big Food and Big Pharma are actually enemies of democracy.
Ik ga erover in gesprek met de Britse cardioloog Dr. Asim Malhotra.
Dr. Asim Malhotra, welcome in our studio in Edam. First time in the Netherlands, first time in Edam, I guess.
It's first time in Edam, and actually I've been a big fan of your cheese actually for a very long time.
Oh, okay.
But not my first time in the Netherlands. I've come here quite a lot, and I have a lot of affection for this country, and it's treated me very well. My first book was a #1 bestseller here for several weeks in 2017, 2018.
Yeah.
So it's nice to be here.
Yeah, gonna talk about that, of course. Also, in the video you mentioned you want to save 1 million lives at a time. That's hard as a cardiologist.
Well, I think if I was just focusing on doing what I was trained to do initially, which is just putting in, my subspecialized in keyhole heart surgery, which is essentially putting stents into people for blockages for heart attacks, for example, then it would be difficult to save 1 million people. But actually, Christian Barnard, the pioneering heart transplant surgeon, South African, he said, "I've saved 150 people from heart transplantations. But if I concentrated on preventative medicine earlier, I would have saved 150 million."
We will discuss the status of healthcare, the COVID crisis, and what you have contributed to that as a cardiologist, and what you may contribute to that in the future, in your role as a cardiologist. I don't know you very well, so I did a lot of research into you. I started at Wikipedia, which says Asim Malhotra is a controversial British cardiologist. So, the first question, when did you become controversial?
Well, in the time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a controversial and revolutionary act. So I think anyone that speaks the truth right now would be labeled controversial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I also saw this picture. You are with Jamie Oliver and Robert Lustig, writer of the book Fat Chance.
Yeah.
You don't look that controversial. You're pretty mainstream here. What's the story about this picture?
Well, actually, it's interesting. When I first liaised with both Robert Lustig and Jamie Oliver a little bit later, it was in relation to the research that I had read and propagated as an advocate on sugar in terms of the harms of excess sugar. But actually, when I first, in the UK, was probably the first doctor to vocally speak out about the harms of excess sugar in the mainstream. Yeah. I was called controversial then, like called a quack. Can you imagine that? Oh my God, who's this doctor that's saying sugar is bad for you and bad for the heart? Yeah. Now it's accepted. Yeah. So, you know, things go through stages and phases.
Yeah, interesting. We see Robert Lustig, writer of the book Fat Chance, and of course Jamie Oliver. He's, well, contributing to a change of the menu on schools, in schools. So this is before the COVID crisis hit us. So you're not like the TV doctor that got famous because of the COVID crisis. You were pretty active as an activist.
Yeah, I think, I'm not like in any way, shape or form. Yeah, I'm not a TV doctor. I mean, they have a role to play, but that isn't what I'm interested in. I'm primarily I'm a doctor and an activist that wants to disseminate the greater truth around primarily how to manage and prevent, manage, and reverse heart disease. Yeah. And that's where I started my work. But no, my first campaign that hit the mainstream was actually around hospital food. Yeah. And specifically during the obesity epidemic, why are we allowing our hospitals to become a branding opportunity for the junk food industry? Yeah. Like, you know, most of the food still purchased in hospitals, 75% is ultra-processed junk. Yeah. So if the medical profession are going to be seen to be taking the obesity epidemic seriously, why are they staying silent around the fact that, you know, junk food is readily available in hospital? It makes it more acceptable. It's not good for patients, not good for staff. And I wrote about this, and it became a front page commentary, the first major mainstream article I wrote in the Observer newspaper, part of the Guardian Group, in 2011. And the article was entitled, I Mend Hearts, Then I See Our Hospitals Serve Junk Food to My Patients. Yeah. So that was really where I started my initial activism in the mainstream.
Your eye-opener for yourself was a moment with a patient, one of your own.
Oh yes, no, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. No, I was treating somebody in the middle of the night with a heart attack, emergency stenting, a guy in his 50s. And the next morning on the ward round, when I'm having a conversation with him about what's happened and the pills he should take, and also talking about lifestyle and stopping smoking, he gets served a burger and fries during that conversation. Yeah. And he looks at me and says, "Doctor, how do you expect me to change my lifestyle if you're serving me the same crap that likely brought me here in the first place?" So for me, that was a moment that made me think, hold on, this is a great story to try and help people understand how crazy the situation has become, where the food industry themselves, I mean, I remember meeting a very senior executive years ago who worked for Unilever, and he talked about the business strategy of Coca-Cola to make their products available to anyone, anywhere, at any time. Yeah. Even that would apply to a bed-bound patient in hospital who's had a heart attack that can't leave the hospital bed for 24 hours. There were contracts that were made between hospital chief executives and certain food companies where they would have to deliver certain items of food, in particular junk food, like sugary drinks, you know, packet of potato chips, whatever, crisps, to the, and chocolates and candy bars, to the patient in who's bedbound in the hospital. Yeah. That how crazy. So this is, from a business perspective, from their business perspective, it's great, right? You make that food so available to anyone, and you make it acceptable, even to people who are sick, who are likely there because they've been eating these foods.
We were talking about big food, basically. Yeah, we're going to talk about big pharma later in this discussion. Earlier this week, a news item came out in Holland, which says recently 22 organizations sounded the alarm, including the Diabetes Fund, the Heart Foundation, and Cancer Foundation. And they say we're heading for a health disaster. Never before have so many organizations sounded the alarm. This is in Holland. How is this situation compared to your country situation?
To be honest, it's a problem pretty much all over the world, certainly in the Western countries. We also know, although that's maybe a discussion for later, but we also know a recent publication in BMJ Public Health from Dutch researchers were talking about the fact that over the last 3 years, since the beginning of the so-called pandemic when it started, we've got a massive increase in excess deaths, almost 3 million excess deaths since the beginning of 2020 to the end of 2022, and it's still continuing. That's only part of the problem, of course, is deaths, and then there's the morbidity, the diseases and the chronic disease that go along with it. UK, we've had a leveling or stalling of life expectancy since 2010. And now we've got more and more people living with chronic disease. That was even before the pandemic. So more and more people sick, essentially. United States, before the pandemic, had lost 2 to 3 years off their life expectancy. Yeah. So, you know, these are some of the major big countries of the Western world, and the overall population health, we are going backwards. Yeah. We're not improving, we're going backwards.
Yeah. Yeah. So healthcare is a big issue for you, talking about the period before the COVID crisis. So that's why you wrote a book. And the book is called The Piopi Diet.
My first book, yeah. I've written 3 books, but yeah.
Yeah. But one of them was The Piopi Diet,
yes.
And you presented that in 2017.
Yeah.
Right, let's have a look.
We have a healthcare crisis, a major healthcare crisis. More than 60% of the UK adult population are now overweight or obese. And perhaps more disturbingly, 1 in 3 children are in the same category by the time they leave primary school. And the trends are getting worse. Unless we act, 90% of the UK adult population are going to be overweight or obese by 2050, and it's costing the NHS billions. What's the root cause? Well, one of the major root causes, undoubtedly, is the obesogenic environment. It's become almost impossible to avoid sugary processed foods wherever you go, whether it's on the high street, whether it's in gyms, health clubs. But for me, the biggest scandal is that we've even allowed our hospitals to become a branding opportunity for the junk food industry. And that's where my journey started. Towards the end of his life, pioneering heart transplant surgeon Christian Barnard perhaps regretfully said, "I have saved the lives of 150 people through heart transplantations. If I'd focused on preventive medicine earlier, I would have saved 150 million. It turns out that preventive medicine is lifestyle. That medicine is a Piopi diet."
The Piopi diet, a lot of people read the book. But tell me, for the people who didn't, why is it called the Piopi diet?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think let's expand the conventional understanding of what diet means. Diet comes from the original Greek word dieta, which means lifestyle. So it's not just about, but a big component of that, of course, is food. What you eat makes a massive. It's crucial to we need it obviously for survival, but it's also important for thriving. Piopi is the Italian fishing village in southern Italy, not far from Naples, which is the traditional home of the so-called Mediterranean diet, which one of the biggest proponents of that message around the health benefits of that diet was an American scientist called Ancel Keys, and he did most of his research from Piopi. But Piopi itself is almost like a blue zone area. It's a place where it has unusually high longevity. People live well into old age. So I went there with my co-author of the book, and then we did a movie actually about it first, and then a book came off the back of the movie, and the movie was called Big Fat Fix, documentary. And we went to Piopi to actually try and understand and speak to the people there to get a better feel of how they lived and how could we apply that with our modern interpretation of medical science and nutrition science. And then we put that together in the book, which basically covers the components of food, activity or not being sedentary. And perhaps the one that's still most neglected and maybe the most important, because everything stems from that, is chronic psychological stress. They had a very strong sense of community. Like a lot of these places with high longevity, one of the common denominators, because the diets can change a little bit. Clearly, the one factor that is common to all of them is that there's very little ultra-processed food, right? They eat real food, home-cooked food, right? And that's very important for sure. But they also had a very strong sense of community. And if you look at the fact that chronic stress is a risk factor for heart disease like smoking is, and most people now are in chronic stress and not managing it, okay? There is good research to suggest that if you have good community relationships, good family relationships, good friendships, good meaningful, good quality relationships, that can actually protect you from the external stresses of life.
Yeah, and that's based on the life expectancy in that area?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the average life expectancy around when I was, when we were there, I think was well above 90.
Yeah, yeah. So
but they were also healthy into old age. It wasn't just that.
It's not just about food.
No.
It's about lifestyle.
100%. It's a complete package.
But it's one of the reasons why you are a controversial doctor, because in Holland, the Nutrition Center warns against the popular PAYAPI diet. It's popular, so you have that. Which advises against carbohydrates and encourages coconut oil, butter, fish, red wine, eggs, among other things. By following the diet, they say you miss out on important nutrients such as B vitamins and dietary fiber. That's what the Dutch Nutrition Center
No,
said
sure.
about
So it's interesting. One of the lessons I've learned from activists, in fact, one of the people that I consider one of my greatest inspirations was Mahatma Gandhi. And he said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win.
Yeah.
We were really challenging the medical establishment dogma, which has been existent for decades and is now slowly petering out, in part thanks to the stuff I've done with other people, about the low-fat movement, right? And we were basically saying actually fat is essential, particularly olive oil. But they deliberately misrepresented also, I think, what we wrote, because we didn't say avoid carbohydrates. We talked about refined carbohydrates and sugar, because actually the diet promotes, at least 5 to 7 portions of fruit and vegetables every day. Yeah. And separate to that, let me say the facts. There was actually an analysis done of our diet plan in terms of its fiber content, and it was actually well above the recommended average daily intake of fiber. So I think this is just a smearing campaign, to be honest. And a lot of these organizations, I can't talk about the Dutch one, although I'm sure this is a link. A lot of these, unfortunately, this comes onto a bigger topic and the bigger problem. A lot of these so-called respected organizations are not independent. They are funded by big food. Their scientists are funded by big food. And big food is only interested in making money by getting you to eat more. Yeah. So there's a clear conflict here between what is good for people and what the food industry want. And they will engineer foods to become addictive, so you eat more. And this is the major issue, if you like.
Of course, you don't know anything about the Dutch Nutrition Center, but you probably know something about the English.
You're right.
You say they are funded by big food.
Most of these, they have. Well, okay. So in the UK, we had something called the Eat Well Plate, which was from a government organisation called Public Health England. Okay, and this plate was supposed to represent what is healthy eating. And you see even in hospitals. Yeah. And I was a little bit confused, well, not confused. When I looked at this plate, I thought this is a bit odd. There was a lot of starch on there, which is exactly the foods you need to avoid in the current obesity epidemic and what we call people having excess body fat related to heart disease, etc. One of the most important foods to reduce, at least, if not cut out, is starch, refined starch in particular, right? These are foods that are going to raise blood glucose and insulin, which is a main driver of heart disease, all right? They had a lot of starch, but in the corner of the plate, I'm glad you've asked me this question. There's a very interesting story I'm about to share with you, which I've never publicized. In the corner of that plate, they have cakes, biscuits, maybe sugary drinks, whatever. And on that plate, this is a healthy eating guide. So they've got this junk food in the corner. They're not saying don't eat it. And very vague mention, eat less often and in small amounts. There was a publication in the British Journal of Sports Medicine a few years ago, which looked at who were the stakeholders involved in making up that healthy eating plate. McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Cadbury's. Come on, this is a joke. Yeah. I met the chief nutritionist of Public Health England at one stage because there was a battle going on in the mainstream media. I was getting stuff out and I was attacking them, I'll be honest. I was saying this is not right, this is not in keeping with the science, and they're conflicted financially. And the response from the chief nutritionist of Public Health England at the time, in a conversation, it was a very polite conversation with me. Eventually, when I said, listen, I understand there are disagreements and that the evidence base around nutrition is not as solid as it could be. So I can understand why there are so-called diet wars about whether it's people eating an all-meat diet or people going vegan or whatever, right? Most people can agree, however, that ultra-processed food and junk food is bad. Why have you even got those brands and those types of foods on the Eat Well plate? And the response was, Asim, you've got to understand, one of the biggest contributors to our economy is the food industry.
Yeah, like a positive thing.
Yeah, but this is coming. But we are doctors. We're supposed to give people what represent their health, not the interests of organizations. To be honest, that are pathologically self-interested when it comes to making money.
It makes money
through exploiting people.
Yeah, so it makes money. Shut up.
Well, basically, it doesn't matter if they make money from lying or deceiving you or killing people.
Economy.
Or killing people. Well, yeah, it's a false economy, though, isn't it? It's a false economy, and we see that now because the economy cannot thrive if the population is sick.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring this up, because Daan de Wit, jullie kennen hem allemaal, is vaak de gast hier bij Blackbox. Is a journalist and he writes articles and books about physical and mental health. And he's in Sicily right now, in Italy, and he has a question for you.
Hey, Dr. Malhotra. Hi, Yassine. I'm here in Italy, the land of your beloved Pioppi. I would like to thank you for being such a hero already for a long time. 11 years ago, I spotted you and I quoted you many times in my book Weet Wat Je Eet. And 7 years later, I quoted you even more times in Cholesterolmythe. I was wondering, how do you look at the way science was treated, misused during the COVID era, and how it is also misused in the relation to heart disease and heart health?
Great question, Dan. Thank you for that. Absolutely, yes. What has happened over decades, and I'm a root cause guy. What does that mean? Not just in my practice in understanding root cause of people's problems and heart disease, but as a concept. Unless you address the root cause of a problem, any solutions you offer are going to be flawed. What happened during the corona crisis was just an extension of what has been going on for decades. What does that mean? Increasing unchecked, both visible and invisible power of big, powerful corporations, right? Who have captured medical information for purposes of profit and then shaped a narrative that ultimately is, at best, not going to allow patients and the public to get their optimal mental and physical health, and at worst cause them harm. And we saw this exacerbated massively because there was a huge opportunity for making money from many different entities from this fear that was created as a result of the COVID crisis. And whether that comes from, tech companies who obviously made a lot of profit because people stay at home there, and then, instead of working in offices, people were now, having more virtual interaction with each other, and the tech companies benefited from that. The food industry benefited massively because people, again, there seemed to be, because of the stress that was going on, there was an automatic increased consumption in a lot of junk food and other foods to cope with the stress. And in fact, one study in the UK showed that 40% of people gained, I think, 5 kilograms, something crazy like that, or close to 5 kilograms during the pandemic. And then you've got Big Pharma, who then see an opportunity to, rapidly produce a so-called vaccine, which we now know is not a vaccine in any traditional sense, it's more of a genetic technology. It's become probably one of the most, in the short term anyway, the most lucrative product in the history of medicine. So absolutely yes. And now we're dealing with and what's the result? Sadly, it's an epic fail. Yeah. So because all-cause mortality in most of these countries is through the roof.
So basically what you're saying is Big Pharma needs fear to survive.
Yeah, I think
in an economical way.
Yeah.
What does Big Food need to survive?
Well, we all need to eat. That's right. So not everyone needs to take a drug, but we all need to eat to survive. Big Food needs to get people to eat more food, basically. That's what they want, right? That's how they make their money. And the way they do that often is through advertising, making you think you need something you don't need, even putting something. I mean, it's very well documented that when the food industry know that a product is harmful, they will actually market it as being healthy. All right, Big Tobacco did this. At one stage, they would sell cigarettes saying it's good for asthma and whatever else. Once they internally realized it was harmful. Think about that. Yeah. Only psychopaths do that. And actually, that's a diagnosis given to these big corporations by a forensic psychologist and by Joel Bakan, the law professor that wrote the book, The Corporation, that in the way that they conduct their business, they actually fulfill the criteria for psychopathy. That means callous disregard for the safety of others, incapacity to experience guilt from harming them, repeated lying, and conning others for profit.
So basically you need psychology.
Actually, I wouldn't. I'm being. It's very important to make this clear. I'm not attacking individuals within those corporations. I think the system makes good people do bad things, but the legal entity, the legal piece of paper, that means that big corporations have a legal obligation to make profit for their shareholders, not to give you the best treatment. Yeah. That needs to be changed. That needs to be adjusted in the sense that they're also allowed to have what we call limited liability. So even if they cause harm and they deceive people in the process, there's only so much fines that can happen. The shareholders are not a lot liable, so they're more likely to take risky behaviors, right? They're allowed, for example, in medicine, and this is again quite shocking, most doctors don't know what I'm about to say. Medical knowledge is under commercial control, but most doctors don't know that because the information that we use to make decisions on any drug we prescribe pretty much now, that data that we base that information on benefits and harms of the drug has never been independently verified. Yeah. Because the drug companies, they design the studies, they start off actually with a business plan. We've got a product. Before we've even done a study on the product, how much money do we want to make from it? Who do we want to target? Yeah. And then they will design the study to produce those outcomes. Then when the study is done, they misrepresent even the research that's within the study, number one, by exaggerating the benefits and safety of that particular product. Yeah. And the raw data, which is often thousands of pages long in terms of actually understanding how independent was this, is never independently verified. We often just accept one or two studies before it gets approved by the regulator, who take most of their money from Big Pharma. Yeah. I mean, it's not just one problem. It's several layers from when the study is started to what goes down in the consultation room with the doctor and patient that is corrupted all along the way. So what does that mean? Quite often, what people think is safe and effective is actually the complete opposite.
Okay, I want to jump to 2020, the COVID crisis. We had a prime minister. He was talking about COVID measures and what we should do to prevent from becoming sick, etc. You had that moment too, your prime minister in England. What was your first response?
Yeah, it was interesting. I had become vocal on the COVID pandemic as early as March 2020 because I'd seen early data and it made sense to me and I'd looked at it in detail that linked excess body fat conditions with, suboptimal immune system. Mm-hmm. But also those risk factors were the same risk factors that would rapidly improve in terms of heart disease risk within 21 days of just changing diet. So I went on Sky News in March 2020 and said, Boris Johnson basically said, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. You should add in the eat real food, right? And then this is a good opportunity of a public health campaign that if people can get stuff in order quickly, when they get COVID, because I basically said even then, at some point we're all going to get it, we're in a better place to be able to handle it. Yeah. Then Boris Johnson got sick and got hospitalized, and I wrote an article which then featured also on the front page of the Telegraph newspaper, which was it's about to have an honest conversation about weight and COVID, something like that. And I mentioned in the article that I think Boris got hospitalized with COVID because of his weight. And then I was on Good Morning Britain and BBC talking about this, and then it became a big story.
Of course.
Yeah.
But it's still true?
Yeah, so very interesting. I had originally said that there may be a 10-fold increased risk of death from COVID if you're obese. And I got a bit attacked for that at the time, and people saying this is nonsense, etc. Actually, it's been proven correct now. So a large study done in America actually looked at death from COVID in 2020, and what they found was if you were obese, compared to someone who's not got any risk factors at all, right, as in otherwise healthy, you had a 9-fold increased risk of death. The biggest risk factor was high blood pressure, 34-fold increase risk, and 20 times increased risk if you had diabetes and 18 times increased risk if you had heart disease. These are all conditions related to what we call abnormal metabolic health or metabolic syndrome, which are conditions of excess body fat. So really, this was the major issue for sure. And it turns out what I had talked about at the beginning of 2020 has been proven to be absolutely correct. In fact, even worse than we thought.
And what was your opinion about the vaccines at that moment? Early 2020.
Well, there wasn't, of course, a vaccine that, there was...
No, but the plan to create vaccines and the mandates. What was your first response to that?
Well, First of all, I was someone that was able to analyze risk from COVID quite well early on, and the one person that I trusted with this information is probably, I call him the Stephen Hawking of medicine, is Professor John Ioannidis from Stanford, who's a professor of medicine, epidemiology, statistics, etc. Genius, medical genius, very high integrity. And he was quite early on, again with somebody who's become a very good friend of mine, Professor Jay Bhattacharya, saying that they'd done this study in Santa Clara County in California that basically gave a little bit more, certainly needed, a better understanding of the risk from COVID. And actually what they found was, if you were compared to say a very young child to very elderly, there was almost a 1,000-fold increased risk of death from COVID. But also, to put it in perspective, at the worst stage of COVID, and this is now, again, has been published, in the over 70s, a very high risk. In the very vulnerable, say, nursing home people, the risk of COVID death was about, at the worst stage, in the early strain of the virus, about 5%. No. If you were otherwise healthy, over 70-year-olds, about 2.3%. No. And actually, the reality now, and more recently, it was published, in fact, and mentioned again in BMJ Public Health by Dutch researchers, that during 2020, the overall death rate from COVID for everybody was actually about 1 in 500. And if you were under 70, it was essentially the same as the flu. So just think about that. That's very important because even there was a grossly exaggerated fear that then drove certain behaviors and lockdowns and, of course, people wanting a vaccine. But the reality is I wasn't overly, it wasn't something I was overly enthusiastic about, except thinking, okay, well, if you can develop a vaccine in time that is particularly useful for the very high-risk people, the over 70s, fine. I had no issue with that.
Yeah. So your concern came later on in November 21, where you gave an interview to GB News because you received some signals that there would be some, the
some heart
issues could be damaging.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to that story, but I mean, I started getting concerned. I took 2 doses of the vaccine myself for a number of reasons.
You did?
I did. I had 2 doses of COVID vaccine. Yeah, I had 2 doses. And not just that, I went on good.
That's interesting because you don't look obese to me.
No, sure. So my reasoning behind it was multifold. One of them was I felt that I would prevent. I'd basically gone with the narrative, but also it's not just gone with the narrative. The people that I have influenced me around the Too Much Medicine campaign has actually been one of my biggest influences. Has been British Medical Journal. I even know. She's now the former editor, but she was the editor at the time, Fiona Godley, the editor there. And some of the important scientists who have been the most important in exposing pharma corruption, right? They were all very pro-vaccine, right? I'm not, and I've not been, a lot of my work is informed by my patient experience, right? With statins, for example, an overprescribed cholesterol-lowering drug, I saw side effects, and I went public on that. They were much more prevalent than what we were being told. But I never come across vaccine injury. I'm not even aware of it existing or being very rare. So I couldn't conceive of there being a harm. I was a bit skeptical about benefits because I know the flu vaccine isn't very effective, right? But I thought, one, okay, if I was going to take it, it was to protect my patients. Yeah. The other reason was, and this is an important reason, and I'm sure a lot of people went through this for different reasons, I had a very strong pressure from my father, who was a retired GP, vice president of the BMA, who was very scared, fearful about COVID, like a lot of older people were, right? The way that the narrative was pushed, I can understand why they got scared, especially they knew they felt they were high risk, although it was still exaggerated. And we'd lost our mum, his wife, my mother, only, a couple of years earlier. And he'd lost his eldest son when I was young. I was only surviving member of his family. And he, for whatever reason, had an exaggerated fear that I was going to get COVID and die. Yeah. And we had arguments about it. And actually, in the end, one of the reasons I took it was to appease him. Yeah, we were having rows. Yeah, and I just said, fine. Yeah. So that was the reason.
I think a lot of people did that.
No, I know. I get it, and that's why it's important for me to say that because I understand why a lot of people took it. I then went on Good Morning Britain because there was increased, it was noted, and this is interesting, vaccine hesitancy amongst people from ethnic minority communities. And that's across the board. The people from lower socioeconomic classes, some of the marginalized, most marginalized people in society, were the ones that have the least trust in government. Yeah. You can understand why. Yeah. They were the ones that didn't take the vaccine. Yeah. So they wanted me to go on TV and to try and reassure people that it's fine. Yeah. But I actually said, listen, I had some empathy with them, said, look at Big Pharma and what the kind of fraud they've committed for years. But I also said, with everything I knew at the time, and this is still true, of everything we do in medicine, traditional vaccines are the safest. Not every drug has a potential harm, right? Just to put it in perspective, if you look at the published data, and I know there are people out there watching this who are going to say, okay, there are all these other problems with vaccines. That may be true, but right now, with the published data that we have, in comparison, serious adverse event rate from traditional vaccines, 1 in a million.
Yeah.
1 in a million. So for me, I said, listen, I understand there are rational concerns, but I think the irrational concerns are there. And I said stuff about people saying microchips in the vaccine. I did say at the time, and I was wrong about that. I couldn't see a mechanism, but people saying it was going to cause infertility. I know now there was definitely some effect on the reproductive organs, for sure. Even if it was short term, it definitely had an effect. So those are the things that I went to discuss. Yeah. But at a time when we were only offering it to high risk, things evolved quite quickly, and I started becoming suspicious even after a few months when they started saying lower risk people. I said, this doesn't make sense. Fine, I'm a doctor, it's different for me, but people were contacting me, 40s and 50-year-olds, saying, should I have it? I said, no, you're a low risk. You don't need it. So that was even well before this thing. But coming back to November 2021...
It was a turning point for you.
It was a gradual turning point. First of all, I noticed the drug industry, as they would, trying to expand the use of the vaccine to more people, which again got me a bit concerned because I thought that there may be more harm now than good. My dad suffered an unexpected cardiac arrest and died in the summer of 2021. He was a fit and healthy man. I knew his cardiac history. I knew what his heart scan showed from a few years earlier. And his post-mortem showed 2 severe narrowings, which didn't make sense to me. Something had happened that had caused a rapid acceleration in blockages in his heart, which were minor.
Also something to do with the health system, right? Because the ambulance came 30 minutes
No,
later.
sure. Yeah, no, that's fine. That was definitely a component in what also impeded his survival because he had a cardiac arrest, and if you get there within 8 minutes, you're more likely to survive. Yeah. But they didn't explain why he had a cardiac arrest. Yeah. And cardiac arrests are up through the roof. So it didn't explain why did he have a cardiac arrest in the first place. Yeah, ambulance not getting there definitely played a role, but why did he have a cardiac arrest? That's what I was interested in. Yeah. And then when he had a post-mortem and it showed 2 severe narrowings in his arteries, that again was baffling to me. And then in November, then there was the Pfizer whistleblower scandal, which was published in the BMJ by Paul Thacker, based upon somebody that worked within one of the centers for the clinical trials called Brooke Jackson. And she said there were some dodgy things going on with data collection, potentially hiding harms, etc. So that opened my eyes a little bit. And then 2 or 3 things happened simultaneously in October and November of 2021. Times journalist called me, said there's been an increase in heart attacks, 25% in Scotland. What do you think's going on? The second thing was there was a publication in journal Circulation, cardiology journal, where a cardiologist had found in his patients who were being monitored, who were looking after with lifestyle changes, within 2 months of having either Moderna or Pfizer mRNA vaccines, there was an increase from 11% chance of heart attack in 5 years to 25% just in 8 weeks, which is extraordinary. Linked to inflammation, which is my area of interest, so that made me think, now I can explain why my dad may have died. Yeah. And then the third thing was a whistleblower called me from a very prestigious institution in the UK, and basically said there was a cover-up involving the cardiology team there that had accidentally discovered through imaging that this was causing a problem, and they don't want to publish it because they're worried about their losing funding from pharma, which interestingly, I'm glad you've asked me this question now, if we can bring it up. A lot of the most prestigious academic, so-called prestigious academic institutions in the world have also been captured by pharma. A lot of their funding for clinical trials comes from the drug industry, which means they're basically being controlled by these guys, which is not right because that threatens their independence. And one thing that I found very alarming, disturbing, and I'm frankly appalled, is that one of your most respected academic scientists of Holland, Saskia Mostert, who was a lead author on a paper in BMJ Public Health, published a couple of weeks ago, which was very carefully written, I've read it in detail, and suggested there may be, and it needs to be questioned, a link between the vaccine and excess deaths, right, given the correlation temporal association. She is now being attacked by the Princess Maxima Center, which I understand is a well-known academic institution, medical center of this country. They are trying to distance themselves from her. And I find it absolutely appalling. I think it's, and the reason I'm mentioning that is I understand that they take money from Pfizer. Part of their research funding comes from Pfizer. So for me, that's very clearly a big conflict of interest.
And what is her role in the Princess Maxima Center?
Well, she's an academic that works within that institution.
Yeah.
And the paper that was published was affiliated with her institution, clearly.
Yeah.
It went through a peer review over 1 year. Yeah. So it was very thoroughly peer reviewed and published by the BMJ. So for me, I think, it's quite shameful that they are distancing themselves from her. And I say this honestly right now on air. I appeal to Princess Maxima to get involved. This is what is going on right now with this vaccine, with all the data we have, by the way. There's not just one paper. They're trying to isolate it as one study. No, this is one of a multitude of studies of overwhelming evidence of serious, frequent harm from these vaccines. And this, by not having an open discussion in Holland about this, for me, is a huge detriment to the population and the Dutch people. They deserve better. This is anti-democratic.
We have to make that clear. You want an open discussion about this.
Absolutely, open discussion, free from a kind of bullying and
You're
harassment.
Not saying this is true, but it needs to be.
Listen, we have our opinions. I have my opinion. I had to change my opinion. I had to U-turn. It was very difficult for me, by the way. I had to defend my own mind and my position, thinking this vaccine was safe and effective.
Yeah.
Think what one has to go through to be able to then turn one's mind. But the evidence became so clear, my conscience wouldn't allow me to keep quiet. And now when you look at it, and look at the totality of evidence, for me, it's very clear. Very clear that
You need to be a scientist for that.
What's that?
You almost need to be a scientist to understand.
You do, and of course that's something that's, I have a skill as a clinician and I have a skill as someone who's an academic researcher as well, and well published in that area. So I was a professor of evidence-based medicine for 5 years in Brazil. So I have that credentials to at least have that discussion with people. So I understand this, but I also understand the conflicts of interest. I know how institutions, they bully and harass researchers that challenge the status quo if it affects the funding from Big Pharma. I have gone through it myself. So I'm seeing history repeat itself. So Saskia should stay strong and firm, and I can tell you right now, she comes from a place of purity and good intent, and she will be proven to be on the right side of history. But the Princess Maxima needs to get involved. This is very bad for the reputation of that institution, which her name is attached to.
Back to November 21, your a wake-up moment in time, I think, when it comes to vaccines. You gave an interview to GB News.
Yes.
Around the possible damage to the heart because of the vaccines. Let's have a look.
Now, what this abstract has shown, what this research has shown, is that markers associated with increasing the risk of heart attack and probably even progression of underlying heart disease in people who've already got some heart disease has been significantly increased risk from 11% at 5 years, risk of heart attack, to 25%. Now, that's a huge increase. If this is true, then it's very concerning indeed. But in medicine, in good science, we never rely on one study. We need to replicate these findings. However, what I will share with you today on GB News is a few days ago, after this was published, somebody from a very prestigious British institution, cardiology department, researcher, a whistleblower, if you like, contacted me to say that the researchers in this department had found something similar within the coronary arteries linked to the vaccine, inflammation from imaging studies around the coronary arteries. And they had a meeting, and these researchers at the moment have decided they're not going to publish their findings because they are concerned about losing research money from the drug industry. I think that the researchers, I really hope that they take a look in the mirror and realize, the ones from where this whistleblowers come from, they realize that they should publish this stuff because their duty primarily is to patients, not the interests of the drug industry. And I think the third thing, and this has been a discussion that's been ongoing, I think now it's high time that policymakers around the world put an end to the mandates. Because I think if this signal is strong and if it's correct, then history will not be on their side and the public will not forgive them for it.
This is interesting. It's basically the same story that you just told us about the Princess Maxima Center. It's about economical interest.
I'm glad you brought it up. It's when people watch this, they're going to make the connection. Something else to add in. So I have been obviously campaigning. I ultimately decided, because after I did that interview, I don't want to name this institution, but I got attacked as well myself.
Yeah, because you had someone who set the alarm, in your opinion. They approached you. Can you tell us who that is, or is it still?
No, I mean, obviously to protect them.
Yeah.
It's a cardiologist at a very he's now moved on, but a prestigious, university. And let me just say, people can guess, but one of the most prestigious, well-known institutions in the world, in that cardiology department. Yeah. And they'd done some imaging tests with people with heart disease to look, and accidentally found in unvaccinated there was less inflammation or no inflammation that was there in the vaccinated in the arteries. But they decided they weren't going to explore the findings any further because a lead researcher said it may affect our funding from pharma. Yeah. So think about that. This is a culture that's now developed within medicine. And this is just another symptom of how big corporations have really captured everybody. Yeah. But something interesting, so I then got attacked myself behind the scenes, and one institution I'm affiliated with, there were complaints from several people in that organization and calling me an anti-vaxxer, which was just crazy because imagine I have gone on TV initially to say it was safe to elderly people.
There are more people that are calling you an anti-vaxxer. Yeah,
but
are you?
Well, what do you think? I've had 2 doses of the vaccine and then I initially thought it was safe and effective. So I would say to them, if I'm an anti-vaxxer, you're a corruption denier.
Yeah. No, the question is, have you become an anti-vaxxer?
Oh, no, not at all. No, I mean, listen, first of all, I don't even like using this term. I think it's a weaponized term. I think a nicer, more compassionate way to engage in dialogue with people is call them vaccine skeptic. I think anti-vaxxer it's been almost like they've tried to even associate it with being homophobic and anti-Semitic. I mean, this is the weaponization of it deliberately, by the way. It's deliberate. Yeah. They want to, for big pharma, they have created this narrative. Like these people are the enemy, if you like, or they're people that are not worthy, or they're evil, or they're bad. It was deliberately engineered. But on that note, what was very interesting is I then campaigned on helping overturn the vaccine mandates. Right, I was very vocal. I was on BBC News.
That was what this was about.
It was about, but I went on BBC and Sky News because my dad had an ambulance delay, which I then also exposed a cover-up, and that became a national news story in the BBC.
It's good that you mentioned that because this one's 2 months after your father died.
Yeah, right? but the story of my investigation, which then hit the news with a newspaper, a British newspaper in the UK, which then became BBC Headline News, took a few months before that came out. So this was not long after that. So I was then campaigning against the mandates. But
is there a connection between the death of your father and you setting off the alarm when it comes to the COVID measures?
Yeah, no, my personal view, and I think it's quite clear for me and everything I knew about him, and I think that the vaccine is what killed him. Yeah. I think what accelerated heart disease and causes cardiac arrest, for sure. I think that's the primary cause of his death.
Yeah. And did you knew that at that time?
No, I didn't. 21? No, not just that. I remember after he died, I tweeted it out, and there was a lot of social media activity. He was a well-known doctor. And so many people were, giving their opinion. And I remember reading when I was going up on the train to Manchester to see him, after he'd already passed, somebody had tweeted something like, "It's the vaccine." I remember getting really angry.
You became angry?
I was angry. I was like, who's this mad person? Crazy. I blocked them straight away. How can you think something like that? I literally got angry. Think about it. So I understand the mentality of those people that are not fully awake yet and how they have been conditioned to think. But that was then, and we are now in a position where there's been so much evidence and people shouldn't be scared of COVID anymore. They should at least allow a bit more critical thinking. But something very interesting, I then published a paper in the end, peer-reviewed, no rebuttals, of 10,000 words explaining what happened with the vaccine but how we got here, and talking about corporate capture and the economic system and excesses of capitalism and all that kind of stuff that's led to it. And I've been around the world and I've been giving lectures and I've been helping to break the mainstream in many countries where there was no discussion going on in the mainstream. Even if there was a hit piece, it doesn't matter, right? There may well be a hit piece after our conversation today. Go for it, please, right? Because it's going to keep the conversation going, right? We know what the truth is. But I was then a witness in Finland in a court case a few weeks ago, where a Finnish entrepreneur, businessman, had refused entry to have into a coffee shop because he didn't have a vaccine pass. Okay, so he was suing the Finnish government and this coffee company or whatever, this catering company, for human rights violations. But what was interesting in that case is the chief scientist of Finland, who was also the lead vaccine expert for WHO, SAGE, under oath said, by the end of 2021 in December, under oath, she said, we knew that the protection from infection, in quotes, from the COVID vaccine wasn't 50% or 25% or 75%, zero. And they advised, and she said, the mandates give people a false sense of security because it wasn't stopping infection. Can you think about? And they advised governments to, whatever their government, but they didn't release the mandates till 6 months later. And we now know that Pfizer, and I was suspicious about this from the beginning, it's been shown that an investigative journalist in the US uncovered that Pfizer had funded many respectable or grassroots organizations, right? And given them thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, to push the narrative that mandates were necessary. Because that was how they were going to maximize their profits. And it was after we know that they had received information that the vaccine was causing serious harm. Yeah. So think about, for me, I'm sorry, it's very clear, and it's not in being inflammatory, it's about accurate diagnosis. Yeah. This behavior is psychopathic.
Yeah. And serious harm, in your opinion, to the heart attacks and heart diseases specific, right?
Yeah. So well, actually, let me expand it a little bit more. Some independent scientists published in the peer-reviewed journal Vaccine in the summer of 2022 a reanalysis of Pfizer and Moderna's original trials that led to the approval around the world of the drug, of the vaccine, of the genetic technology, whatever you want to call it. And they found in that reanalysis from the very beginning, you were more likely to suffer serious harm from having the vaccine than you were to be hospitalized with COVID, when everything is corrected for. Okay, and that serious harm rate they discovered at 2 months in the short term was 1 in 800, which is huge. Yeah. And of that, 40% of those serious harm events were related to issues related to clotting, whether it was stroke, lung clots, heart attacks, etc.
Yeah. You say we know what the truth is, so we have to talk about the evidence. Let's start with a quote of Joe Biden in 21. Why are you laughing? You always laugh at Joe Biden.
No, it's not about Joe Biden. It's about public figures during the pandemic and making statements with such certainty when there was a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah. Well, this is about a quote of him in July 21, where he said, "You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations," which opened up a discussion about the relative and the absolute risk. Let's have a look.
Was there ever any basis for saying what Joe Biden or Dr. Sarah said? I was startled to read this earlier today. What was reported in the mainstream news as being 95% effective against infection was in fact relative risk reduction, not absolute risk reduction.
If we talk about the Pfizer vaccine, for example, that trial, it showed this 95% relative risk reduction in infection. Everyone took on board as thinking 95%. If 100 people were exposed, 95 would be protected, which is not the case. It was 0.84% from infection.
This is actually a pretty common claim that I see repeated a lot by anti-vaxxers on social media, but it is not correct. The way Dr. Malhorta got those numbers is he calculated the absolute efficacy or the absolute risk of getting COVID in those phase 3 clinical trials. But that's not really a reliable or accurate way to calculate these things. That's why we use relative risk in these clinical trials to determine the efficacy of the drug.
Yeah, the last person we saw was Dr. Wilson from the YouTube channel Debunk the Funk. He's a biologist. And this is about the difference between the relative risk and the absolute risk calculation. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah. In very simple terms, relative risk, so if you have two groups of people, right, let's say clones, 100 people and another 100 people who are clones, right, of the first group, and you want to test a drug to see whether it's efficacious and how efficacious it is, you give one group the actual drug and you give the other group a dummy pill. So they don't know whether, both groups don't know what they're getting, okay, but the data is being analyzed. You then follow them up and let's say you're looking at, does this drug prevent heart attacks? In the group that you give, get the dummy pill, so they're not getting any treatment really, anything different, over a 5-year period, let's say that's a trial of this, right? Over a 5-year period, you follow them up, and let's say 2 of them out of 100 developed a heart attack.
Yeah.
Okay? Then you see, well, what benefit did you get from the people that took the drug? So the 100 people that were followed up, who are clones of the first group, if you like, and only one of them developed a heart attack, right? So instead of 2, you've got 1 person. That's 50% reduction. Yeah. 1/2 is 50%. Yeah. But the absolute reduction, you've treated 100 people with a drug, and you've stopped 1 person having a heart attack. So that's what we call absolute risk reduction, which is 1%. Okay.
And we should look at that, in your opinion.
Or 100. It's not my opinion. actually. Although it has become, but it didn't originate from me. In 2009, the World Health Organization put a bulletin out, and people can look this up online and check the facts. And this is a statement from an article from the man who's considered the world leading researcher on health and statistical literacy, and his name is Gerd Gigerenzer from the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. He said, "It is an ethical imperative that doctors and patients understand the difference between relative and absolute risk to protect patients from unnecessary anxiety and manipulation." In other words, and I've met Gerd, I know him and I've read his work, and it's actually, to be honest, anyone that, any good scientist, any ethical scientist, any ethical doctor knows that by communicating relative risks, you are misleading people. The more honest way to explain for informed consent, and in fact, this is what I do in my practice, is you have to, when that data is available, you have to tell patients the absolute risk reduction, not. So instead of me saying to patients, if you take this pill, you're 50% less likely to get a heart attack, which you can say if you want, it has to be backed up by saying, in absolute terms, there's a 1 in 100 chance for you, if you take this religiously for the next 5 years, it's going to protect you having a heart attack. Yeah. And you do that because actually the more ethical and advanced or better way, if you like, of practicing medicine, that also comes from the medical Royal Colleges in the UK, because I was a lead author in a paper around winding about the harms of too much medicine with the establishment doctors who I got on board. Even in that paper, we said that doctors need to be practicing this way. Most doctors aren't, unfortunately, because one of the barriers is some of it's training. We're not conditioned to communicate statistics this way. And there's a lot of, actually, unfortunately, there's a lot of statistical illiteracy amongst doctors. You know, one survey in America revealed, well, first of all, amongst the public, and this is not a criticism, it's just a form of educating them and making sure that's part of the conversation. 75% of educated US adults could not convert 1 in 1,000 into a percentage. 25% of doctors couldn't either. So this is a big problem. But you see, without understanding the numbers involved, the public are vulnerable to exploitation of their hopes and fears by political and commercial interests. Yeah. And that's exactly what we saw during the pandemic. Yeah. The evidence of harm from this vaccine, in terms of the different types of data, is way worse than the harms of the evidence on the harms of sugar for heart health. Yeah. Yeah. There's also, so if we're wrong about this and we're wrong about sugar, so this doesn't make any sense. So the evidence in terms of it's overwhelming. Yeah. What we need to do next, actually, we have a pandemic of vaccine injured, okay? I think highly likely, let me be very specific in my language.
Quote. We have a pandemic of vaccine injured.
Highly likely, I have my own personal opinion, but let me say as a scientist, highly likely that millions of people around the world have either been seriously harmed or killed by this vaccine, on the best data that we have. What we need now, not just an investigation to stop this happening again, is that we need now all of the best minds that medical science has to find out solutions to help these people. Yeah. I'm also vaccine injured myself. So I worry. I don't know what's going to happen in the long term. So I want solutions.
So everybody that's hearing you now and took the vaccine also,
I'm worried that everybody that's taken the vaccine is at risk.
Will this recover?
I hope it will, but we don't know. Listen, with everything that we looked at the moment, most of the serious harms appear, certainly from the cardiovascular point of view, tend to be in the first few months. I think with heart attacks and excess deaths, I think it's going to go on for years, because if we've accelerated heart disease from a baseline, there's something that was a lower risk has suddenly increased that risk, and that will continue for years. Yeah. Okay, so people that let's say we had a crystal ball, before the vaccine, they were going to drop dead of a heart attack in 20 years, say a middle-aged person, is now maybe having one in 5 years or 10 years, or even less. Yeah. Do you get me? And that's going to keep going on for a while, right? So that's a problem. But there are so-called antidotes, if you like, to that from lifestyle and heart disease reversal, and that's part of my area of interest around lifestyle. You can do things to at least reduce that risk, and that's important. But other things like, for example, one of the most eminent oncologists in his field, who's also an immunologist and has a rare expertise, is Angus Dalgleish, emeritus professor from St. George's University in London. He's made it quite clear, and there are now data even coming out from Japan suggesting that certainly there is a clear link with people who had boosters, who had more than 2 doses, immunosuppression and increased cancer, right? Mm-hmm. So all of this is now coming. We need complete transparency. We need to look at the raw data of Pfizer. What did they know from the beginning? But we need all these scientists to come together and say, listen, we now know these are the problems. We need who is more vulnerable, who is not vulnerable. Yeah. These are the tests to be done. These are the solutions. Yeah. We have a pandemic of the vaccine injured. It is a massive public health crisis. And in my view, is the main likely driver of the excess deaths going on around the world.
Yeah. You call yourself a vaccine victim. Can I say it like that?
Yeah.
I didn't took the vaccine, so I'm not.
You're wiser than me, man. Good for you.
Thank you. I'm not a cardiologist, so that's all you. But do you have any evidence for yourself within what you feel within your body?
Yeah, no, I didn't feel right even after the first 2 doses. I had a period of depression which lasted for a while. And we know from the original, what was interesting is the World Health Organization themselves, and I put it in my paper, had produced a list at the beginning of potential serious adverse effects from the vaccine, right? And every system in the body was involved, including the brain. And there are now reports and things that it affect people's mental health as well, inflammation in the brain, right? So that's one thing. I've had another issue which has affected me in terms of my gut microbiome has been massively affected. And this is from a very eminent researcher in America who's looked at vaccine injured and said to me, I have the signature of vaccine injured, which is also inhibiting my ability to combat depression, which I'm also suffering from at the moment. So there's a few things going on. I have a flare-up of psoriasis. You know, it's an autoimmune condition affecting the skin. I'd essentially cured it years ago, and that's probably also linked to the gut. So absolutely, yeah, 100%.
I also spoke to Frank van der Groot. He's a forensic pathologist, and he also sees an increase in myocarditis among young people. Yeah. And he wonders whether it's clear if you can make a distinction between the coronavirus, the cause, and the vaccine as a cause. Is that already clear? Can you make that distinction?
Yeah, I think, listen, every diagnosis in medicine has different components that are necessary to help make that diagnosis. But in general terms, 80% of your diagnosis comes from the history of the conversation. So in this particular case, I think the most reliable way to try and distinguish between vaccine-induced myocarditis and COVID is actually just a conversation. Did somebody had COVID? When did they have the vaccine? When did they get myocarditis? Yeah, exactly. So that you can give a more likelihood. It's more likely to be this. Yeah. And I've managed many of these patients myself and made that diagnosis.
So besides healthcare, is trust also an issue when it comes to the trust in the government when people have to decide, well, do I take a vaccine or not? Is trust also an issue? Trust in governments?
I think so. Well, governments take advice from scientists. So I think people presume if a government are putting out something, if there are not enough doctors and scientists being vocal to oppose it, then people will presume that this has been approved by the medical profession. The medical profession themselves, I think almost 99% of them, most of them actually have good intentions. The problem is they don't realize that the information they're using has been corrupted. So I think they are well-intentioned, but I think over time there has been such a collusion, if you like, for financial gain between academic institutions, medical journals, some doctors, that they have the line between good science, transparent, honest science, and corrupted, totally corrupted information for the purposes of making money. I think that line has unfortunately disappeared. Yeah. And a lot of them don't even realize what they're doing. So for me, I want to trust my government. I want to trust the medical establishment because we can't be experts in everything, right? And we have to go with what we are told quite often from so-called experts. But this is a systemic failure, where we have allowed these big, powerful corporations to get so much power that they are more powerful than governments. This is not really so much a government issue. I think the government are just puppets. And I speak to politicians myself, very senior people, former members of cabinets, right? Health secretaries. I've had one-on-one conversations. They come to me for medical advice, cross-party. I don't affiliate with any particular party. And they are good people that think they're doing the right thing, but they're using information that has come from lobbyists that they think is complete, and then backed up by organizations where the doctors themselves who are in power are in bed with industry, to put it in no better way. Yeah. And the profession itself is hierarchical and obedient. Yeah. But that's a risk factor for abuse of power. So this is why we are where we are.
A lot of people took the vaccine because of their father, because of their mother, because they could go to the shops, they could go out. A lot of people didn't take it because of their own health. Doesn't that at itself has a major effect on the trust in governments a few years later.
It does.
When people have to decide for themselves, do I take this vaccine again for others?
Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. And that's why it's so important for them to be candid and say, listen, something's gone very wrong here. Let's pause, let's stop with the use of this technology. Let's investigate it and let's come out with meaningful solutions to understand what's happened and stop it happening again and reduce the harm. That's it. But the longer they go on without acknowledging that, the longer it's going to take to regain trust. Doctors make mistakes, right? We are taught in medical school, we have to be honest and open straight away. Patients are very forgiving if they think your intentions were pure. They will not be forgiving if they think that not only did you make a mistake, but you then covered it up.
Finally, when I did the research to you, I ended up in a video from the Charlie Foundation in 2020. You are saying a lot of interesting things, in my opinion. Okay. Let's look at that.
As a good scientist, you've got to be able to even question your own theories. And that cultural mindset still amongst public and a lot of doctors is they think it's an exact science and that these medicines that we prescribe to people are very effective, and they're actually not, and they come with side effects, and then the lifestyle gets neglected. So then we have to kind of shift the balance back, to focusing at the lifestyle prescription at the forefront of managing most conditions. And medicines is backup. The law is stacked also on the side of the corporates. Yeah. So we have to change the law as well, because actually speaking out, you make yourself very vulnerable because they've got so much legal power to keep that information sequestered, So I would just say this is a whole, I'm going to say something tomorrow, I'll share this with you privately, but I'm going to say that basically big food and big pharma are actually enemies of democracy. Because we cannot live in true democracy unless people are fully informed about the decisions they're making, and they're not being fully informed. And there is an epidemic of misinformed doctors, and then misinformed and unwittingly harmed patients. And that is at the root of our healthcare system failure.
Big food and big pharma are the enemies of democracy. Quite a quote.
Factual. If they are curating information for you that affects what you put into your body or what you eat, purely for the purpose of profit, and harming you in the process and covering that up, and you don't know about it, there's no democracy. I believe in a real democracy, fully informed population making decisions about what's good for themselves and for society, and we don't have that right now. Yeah. Democracy is dying, and those are the two of the biggest enemies of democracy.
So people have to take a look at the interests behind big food.
Absolutely.
Looking back, on the COVID crisis, was this a healthcare crisis or a COVID crisis?
It was both. We had a fast pandemic that exploited a slow pandemic of chronic disease. So even before the COVID, our healthcare systems had no slack in the system. And then we just made it worse. I think in part by, lockdowns. I think I'm much more of the opinion that supports the Great Barrington Declaration, which was put together by Professor Jay Bhattacharya, Sunetra Gupta, Martin Kulldorff from Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard, who basically said we should have had focused protection for the elderly. We missed out on opportunities to optimize people's immune systems, either from dietary changes or even supplements like optimizing vitamin D levels, vitamin C, maybe some other modalities. I think the jury's out, but it seems like there was potentially a solution with the use of ivermectin early on, but that would not have allowed the drug companies to make money. So what we've got actually at the root of all of this, is that what Western medicine in many ways is an extension or rooted in colonialism, right? And what does that mean? Well, a lot of the solutions to our health problems come from non-pharmacological interventions, right? Lifestyle, for example, social issues that need to be resolved. But that model, to survive, the current Western medical model, which over-medicates the population, in part survives by deliberately suppressing alternative, safer, more equitable, cheaper solutions, like ancient healing arts of the East and lifestyle. Think about during the pandemic, suddenly natural immunity didn't mean anything anymore.
But that's
natural immunity didn't mean anything anymore. Think about that.
Aren't we asking ourselves, or the government, the wrong question? Like the question was, how can we combat this virus with medication? Should the question not be like, how can a relatively harmless virus have such a disruptive effect on society? Isn't that the main question?
Absolutely, yes. Certainly relatively harmless for people who are non-elderly. Absolutely, yes.
So how can you say this was a COVID crisis also? Basically, it all ends up in a healthcare crisis, right?
Oh, of course. Absolutely.
That's the fundamental
100%. 100%. It's a healthcare crisis and it's a population health crisis. You know, healthcare applies in many ways to what doctors do, what happens in hospitals, what happens in general practice, surgeries. But most of what determines your health is not determined by your doctor. It happens outside the hospital grounds. But what goes on outside the hospital grounds in effect will then put pressure on acute problems that develop from stuff that builds up over time linked to lifestyle. So yeah, absolutely.
But even if the vaccine would work and wouldn't be harmful, you can ask yourself the question, was this vaccine program good for society when it comes to healthcare? Because what the government basically is saying is, okay, we have this crisis, stay in your lane, get on the couch, get the chips and cola from the big,
what they're doing,
big food.
Yeah, no governments, as far as I'm concerned, around the world, certainly not in the Western world, have done anything to really address properly the root cause of the population health crisis. I agree, 100%. So they're not, by doing this, they're only fueling that problem. Yeah. You know, again, sit at home, eat junk food, watch TV. Yeah. From a virus that was relatively harmless for the overwhelming majority of people.
Is that where Big Food and Big Pharma came together, basically?
Yeah, I don't think they actually colluded, but the system means that they are, in a way, they are colluding. They're helping each other, 100%.
You mentioned already earlier in the interview your father died in 21, September 21, and in an interview with BBC you said, "I'm personally holding the government directly responsible for the death of my father, and I'm already considering taking legal actions against the government for this." This was about the ambulance that was not on time, right?
Yeah.
Is anything you do right now in terms of your goal around vaccine damage, has there something to do with that moment in time, the death of your father?
I can't completely dissociate it because obviously I lost the last surviving member of my immediate family to what seems to me clearly the primary driver of the cause of the COVID vaccine. But I think I would have been on this anyway, irrespective. It gave me insight into one particular mechanism of harm, which I could relate to because that's my area of expertise of the heart, right? That was my expertise. So one particular mechanism of harm, which I can be considered probably, you know, an expert, a very specific expert on, in the way that he died. But it, you know, I think, you know, that definitely informed me a lot. But no, I think, you know, given my track record over the last almost 15 years of being a very outspoken public health advocate and taking on vested interests, I probably would have been involved in some way. And in fact, to be honest, I already had been getting you know, attacks from, you know, some of the stuff even 2020 when I was trying to talk about population health and lifestyle and everything else. You know, that was before my dad died. I was talking about this and taking some hits and even questioning lockdowns and writing articles about face masks. So I would have been involved in this in some way, shape or form anyway, irrespective. But yeah, of course it's had an influence.
Yeah. If we would look at you, at your journey that you're on right now, what would he think? What would he say?
Well, I think he was always very proud of what I did. Very proud. You know, every media interview I did, I would never tell him about everything because I was like, you know, but he would insist on wanting to watch it or finding out and give me feedback. So, no, I think he'd be proud.
Thank you, Dr. Massim Malhotra. Thanks for your time. And what should we do in terms of your journey? Where can we get some more information? What are you doing in media? Do you have your own channel?
I'm very active on Twitter. So I'm on as Dr. Massim Malhotra on Twitter. On Instagram, I'm Lifestyle Medicine Doctor. I have a website, which is drmassim.com. But I think the most important bit of work right now to help disseminate the truth, which is something I put a lot of time and effort into, including, you know, the people we've interviewed are some very eminent experts in their fields that are going to be accepted, that are accepted by mainstream, very difficult to attack them, who are going to unravel the issue of big pharma and to some degree big food and also solutions is a documentary that I'm currently finishing, which will be out in September probably, called First Do No Pharm, P-H-A-R-M. So if people want to look at what it's about and the trailer and contribute, because we're crowdfunding for it to finish it off, they can go to the website nopharmfilm.com.
So let's do that. Thank you for your time, and we keep in touch.
Thank you, mate.